Hello, and welcome back. Tonight, I want to take you somewhere unusual. Not a drawing room, not a country manor, but a theatre. A real one, tucked away in the heart of London, with velvet seats, gaslight memories, and a stage that has heard 1,000 final lines. But on this particular evening, one line was never finished. The leading actress was mid-speech, the audience watching, the curtains drawn tight, the doors locked from the inside, when her voice simply stopped. No scream, no struggle, just silence, and the faint echo of her own words bouncing back from an empty stage. Seated quietly in the stalls was a man with a waxed moustache and a mind that missed nothing. Hercule Poirot. Let's begin. The Aldwych Playhouse. The Aldwych Playhouse had stood on its narrow London street since 1897. A squat Edwardian building with a facade the colour of weak tea and a foyer that smelled perpetually of dust, grease paint and old velvet. It was not the grandest theatre in London. That honour belonged to the houses further west, with their electric marquees and queues stretching round the block. But it had a certain stubborn dignity, like an elderly aunt who refuses to update her wardrobe and is, in consequence, always slightly, but definitely, out of fashion. It was here, on a damp evening in early October, that Hercule Poirot found himself seated in the third row of the stalls, his grey Homburg resting on his knee, his moustaches waxed to a state of geometric perfection, and his expression one of mild, well-mannered boredom. He had not wished to come. "You will enjoy it enormously," Hastings had promised him 3 days prior, waving the invitation card as though it were a winning lottery ticket. "A private performance, mon ami, just for friends of the theatre. Margaret Thorne is playing Hedda. You know how highly she's spoken of." "I know," Poirot had replied, "that I have never in my life understood why the English theatre insists on plays where everybody is unhappy and nobody, at the end, has accomplished anything whatsoever." But Hastings had insisted, and here Poirot sat, mildly regretting his soft-heartedness, while around him the private audience, perhaps 40 persons, all known to one another, all dressed with the particular carelessness of people who consider themselves too sophisticated for full evening dress, murmured and rustled their programs. The theatre was owned, as of 18 months previous, by a man named Julian Reeve, who had inherited it from an uncle, along with a modest fortune and a considerably less modest appetite for the dramatic arts. An appetite, Poirot privately suspected, better suited to watching plays than producing them. Reeve stood now near the front, in conversation with a thin, anxious young man whom Poirot took to be the director. "Charles Amory," Hastings supplied, following Poirot's gaze. "Directs most of the productions here. Bit highly strung, but talented, they say." "They say a great many things, Hastings, about a great many people. It is rarely so simple as they say." Hastings, who had heard this particular observation in one form or another for the better part of 30 years, merely smiled and returned his attention to his programme. The play that evening was Ibsen's Hedda Gabler. A curious choice, Poirot thought, for what was billed as a celebratory performance, since the piece concerned itself almost entirely with a woman's slow suffocation and eventual self-destruction. But the English, he had long ago concluded, possessed an inexhaustible appetite for watching tragedy unfold from the comfort of a good seat. In the title role was Margaret Thorne, a name that meant, to those who followed such things, a face of considerable beauty and a temperament of considerable difficulty. Poirot had seen her only once before, several years prior, in a lesser role in a lesser play, and had thought at the time that she possessed a rare quality, the ability to make an audience believe, for 2 hours, that the person on stage was not acting at all, but simply living, unobserved, and that the audience had merely been permitted to watch. "She is difficult, they say," Hastings murmured, apparently unable to resist continuing his catalogue of gossip. "Temperamental, fought with the last 3 directors. Amory's the only one who'll still work with her, and even he stopped, because the house lights had begun to dim. Poirot settled back in his seat, arranging his hands upon the head of his cane, and permitted himself a small sigh, the sigh of a man resigning himself to 2 hours of English melancholy. He did not know, of course, that he was about to witness a death. Backstage, in the moments before the curtain rose, the atmosphere was rather different from the polite hush of the stalls. 5 minutes, Miss Thorne. The voice belonged to Dennis Cole, the stage manager, a stocky man of perhaps 50, with the permanently harried expression of someone who had spent 3 decades keeping actors on schedule against their will. He knocked once on the dressing room door and did not wait for a reply, because he had learned, over the years, that waiting for a reply from Margaret Thorne was an inefficient use of the 5 minutes in question. Inside, Margaret sat before her mirror, applying the last touches of powder with the mechanical precision of a woman who had performed this ritual 1,000 times and felt nothing whatsoever about it any longer. She was 38, though she played younger with an ease that had begun, in the last year, to require rather more effort than it once had, a fact she resented with a quiet, corrosive bitterness that few people saw, and fewer still were permitted to mention. Her dresser, a mousy girl named Ruth, hovered near the costume rack. "You're very quiet tonight, Miss Thorne." "I am always quiet before a performance, Ruth. It is not a mystery, it is concentration." But it was not, in fact, entirely concentration. There had been a note left in her dressing room that afternoon, unsigned, 3 lines only, and Margaret had read it twice before folding it into the smallest possible square and dropping it into the small brass wastepaper bin beside her mirror, where it now sat, crumpled, beneath a discarded stocking. She had told no one about the note. She had, in fact, decided, with the peculiar, brittle confidence of a woman convinced she understood exactly what she was dealing with, that she would handle the matter herself, after the performance, quietly, without fuss. It was a decision she would not live to regret, because there would be no time left in which to regret anything at all. 2 minutes, Miss Thorne," called Dennis Cole from the corridor. Margaret Thorne rose, smoothed the front of her dress, and looked at herself in the mirror for one final moment. Not, Ruth would later recall, with the usual expression of an actress steeling herself for a role, but with something closer to grim resolve, as though she were about to step not onto a stage, but into an argument she fully intended to win. She walked to the wings, the curtain rose, and Hercule Poirot, seated in the 3rd row with his cane across his knee, watched Margaret Thorne begin the performance that would be, though no one in that theatre yet knew it, the last of her life. The words that were not written. The first act passed as first acts generally do, with exposition, with the slow assembling of a world the audience must be made to believe in before it can be permitted to fall apart. Margaret Thorne, in the role of Hedda, moved about the stage with a controlled restlessness that Poirot found, despite himself, rather compelling. There was something beneath her performance that night, some private current running under the lines, though he could not, at that early stage, have said what it was. "She's better than usual," Hastings whispered, during the brief pause as the set was adjusted for the second act. "Sharper, somehow." "Sharper," Poirot repeated thoughtfully. "Or more afraid." Hastings blinked. "Afraid? Of what?" "That, mon ami, I do not yet know." "But an actress who is only acting does not grip the arm of a chair in quite that manner." He gestured, faintly, toward the stage, though the chair in question had already been struck and carried off. "It is a small thing, perhaps nothing at all. I merely observe it." The second act began. It was here, Poirot would later note with some professional embarrassment, that he made his first small error of the evening, though it was an error shared by every other person in the audience, and one might argue it was hardly an error at all, but simply the natural consequence of watching a play performed by a very good actress. For at a certain point in the second act, Margaret Thorne began to depart, in small ways, from the text. Poirot had read Hedda Gabler, not with enthusiasm, but with the thoroughness of a man who preferred to know a thing before dismissing it, and he was aware, in a general sense, of its shape and its language. And yet, as the act progressed, he found himself experiencing a curious sensation. Certain lines seemed to land with unusual weight. Certain pauses stretched a fraction longer than the rhythm of the scene required. And once, just once, Margaret Thorne looked out into the darkened house, not toward her fellow actor, but past him, into the stalls, with an expression that had nothing whatsoever to do with Hedda Gabler and everything to do with Margaret Thorne. At the time, Poirot attributed this to artistic license, the small liberties a confident actress permits herself in a private, friendly performance, where the usual discipline of a long run has perhaps relaxed. It was only afterward, considerably afterward, that he understood the truth, that Margaret Thorne had not been departing from her lines at all. She had been speaking to someone, using Ibsen's words as a kind of code, and the message had not been intended for the audience. "She is talking to someone," he murmured to Hastings, frowning. "She's talking to Judge Brack. That's the play, old man." "No," said Poirot slowly. "I do not think it is only the play." But he did not pursue the thought further, because the act was drawing to its close, and the house had grown very quiet, and it did not occur to him, it could not have occurred to him, that within the hour Margaret Thorne would be dead. The interval brought the usual bustle of an English audience released briefly from its obligation to sit still, the shuffling toward the small bar at the rear of the foyer, the murmured exchanges of opinion, the lighting of cigarettes. Poirot, who found intervals a useful opportunity for the observation of human nature undiluted by drama, remained near the foyer's edge and watched. He observed Julian Reeve, the theatre's owner, deep in what appeared to be an uncomfortable conversation with a broad-shouldered man Poirot did not recognize. A conversation conducted in low voices, with Reeve's hands moving in small, placating gestures, as though attempting to calm a matter that did not wish to be calmed. He observed Charles Amory, the director, standing entirely alone near the foyer's far wall, smoking with the rapid, joyless efficiency of a man who does not enjoy cigarettes, but requires, at that moment, something to do with his hands. And he observed, briefly, a woman he had not previously noticed, dark-haired, perhaps 30, dressed with quiet expense, who slipped backstage through a door marked private, using a key of her own, without any of the hesitation of a visitor unfamiliar with the building. "Who is that?" Poirot asked Hastings, indicating the woman with a small motion of his head. Hastings followed his gaze. "Vivienne Carr, understudy to Miss Thorne, I believe. Doesn't get much chance to perform. Margaret's not the sort to miss a show for a head cold." "Ah," said Poirot, and filed the observation away, as he filed away all such small and possibly meaningless facts in the neat and capacious cabinet of his mind. The bell rang. The audience returned to its seats. The house lights dimmed for the final time that evening. The third act of Hedda Gabler is, for those unfamiliar with it, the act in which the play's quiet devastations begin, at last, to surface, in which Hedda, cornered by circumstance and by Judge Brack's soft, terrible blackmail, begins to understand that her situation has no honorable exit remaining to her. Margaret Thorne played this act with an intensity that silenced even the faint rustlings of program pages that had persisted through the earlier scenes. Poirot found himself, despite his earlier reservations about English melancholy, genuinely absorbed. It was during this act that Margaret Thorne began her final, long speech. Hedda's speech, delivered alone on stage, the other actors having withdrawn into the wings for the scene's construction. And it was during this speech that something in the theatre changed, though it would take Poirot some minutes, and considerable subsequent reflection, to identify precisely what. The stage lighting, which had been warm and low throughout the act, brightened suddenly and without evident theatrical purpose, a technical error, Poirot assumed at the time, though he would later learn it was nothing of the kind. Margaret Thorne, midline, faltered, not the practiced falter of an actress building tension, but a genuine, unmistakable hesitation, as though she had, for one instant, forgotten not her line, but her very reason for being on the stage at all. She recovered. She continued. But her voice, Poirot noted, had changed in quality, grown thinner, somehow, and strained, as though she were speaking not merely words, but words that cost her something considerable to produce. "Something is wrong," Poirot murmured, sitting forward. "She's just acting, old man," Hastings whispered back, though even he, unpracticed as he was in matters of the theatre, seemed to sense that something in the atmosphere had shifted. Margaret Thorne reached the final line of her speech. She did not finish it. The voice from the empty stage. What happened next would be described, later, in as many different ways as there were witnesses to describe it. For it is a curious feature of sudden shock that it fractures a room's memory into a dozen incompatible pieces, each perfectly sincere and each perfectly at odds with the others. What was agreed upon by every person Poirot later interviewed was this: Margaret Thorne, standing alone at the center of the stage, stopped speaking mid-sentence. Her mouth remained open for a moment, as though the next word were simply delayed rather than absent. Then her hand rose, slowly, almost thoughtfully, to her throat. And then, with no cry, no stumble, no dramatic collapse of the kind the play itself might have called for, she sank to her knees and then to the boards and did not move again. For perhaps 4 seconds, the audience believed it was watching Hedda Gabler die, as Hedda Gabler is, in the strictest sense, supposed to do, though not, it should be said, in quite this manner, and not at this point in the text. It was Charles Amory, watching from the wings with the particular attentiveness of a director who knows his own production down to the second, who first understood that something had gone wrong. He was on the stage within moments, kneeling beside her, and the expression on his face, visible even from the third row, told the audience, more effectively than any scream could have done, that they were no longer watching a play. "House lights!" he shouted, his voice cracking across the auditorium. "Someone get the lights up. Get a doctor. Someone get a doctor." The house lights rose with a suddenness that felt, to everyone present, faintly obscene, as though the theatre itself had been caught in an indiscretion. The audience, 40 persons who had a moment before been comfortably absorbed in fiction, now sat in the sudden brightness, staring at a woman lying motionless upon a stage that had, until seconds ago, been merely a drawing room in Norway. Poirot was on his feet before he had entirely decided to rise. Hastings beside him. Poirot. Yes, Hastings. "I see it." He did not run. Poirot never ran, considering it undignified and, in his professional experience, rarely useful. But he moved with a brisk economy toward the small pass door at the side of the stalls that connected. He knew from long habit of noticing such architectural details in every building he entered, directly backstage. By the time he reached the stage, a small, frightened crowd had gathered. Amory, kneeling. Dennis Cole, the stage manager, standing with the particular helplessness of a practical man confronted with a problem no amount of practicality could solve. Vivian Carr, the understudy, white-faced in the wings. And, hurrying from the auditorium, a stout, balding man whom someone identified, in the general confusion, as Dr. Instis, a physician who had, by pure chance, been among the invited guests that evening. Instis knelt beside Margaret Thorne for a period of perhaps 90 seconds. When he rose, his face had the particular grey composure of a medical man delivering news he has delivered before and never grown accustomed to delivering. "She's dead," he said simply. "I'm sorry, there was nothing." He stopped, looked more closely at the fallen woman, and frowned. "I should like to examine her more carefully before anyone moves her. This does not look to me entirely natural." It was at this point that Poirot, standing quietly at the edge of the gathered crowd, asked the question that would, in the days to come, prove to be the true beginning of the case. "Doctor, when you say not entirely natural, you refer, I think, not merely to the suddenness, but to something more specific, perhaps the eyes, the color of the lips." Instis looked up, surprised to be addressed with such precision by a stranger. Yes, exactly that." The lips, and a certain, I should want to test for it properly, of course, but my first impression, he glanced, almost apologetically, at the small crowd of stricken faces around him. My first impression is poison, something fast-acting, a cyanide compound perhaps, though I would not swear to it without proper examination. A ripple went through the small gathering. Not a gasp exactly, for the shock of the death itself had already exhausted the crowd's capacity for audible reaction, but a kind of collective stiffening, as though every person present had, in that moment, begun silently reviewing their own movements of the last hour. Poison, Amory repeated numbly, still kneeling beside the body, seemingly unable to rise. But she was speaking, she was in the middle of the speech, she was, Monsieur Amory. Poirot's voice was gentle but firm, the voice of a man accustomed to steadying others in moments when steadiness was in short supply. I understand this is a terrible shock, but I must ask, has anyone sent for the police? It was Dennis Cole who answered, his voice hoarse. I'll ring them now. There's a telephone in the office. He hesitated, glancing toward the wings, toward the heavy iron pass door that led to the theatre's rear corridor. Though I don't rightly see how, I mean to say, sir, nobody came near her. Nobody could have. She was alone on that stage from the moment the scene began. Alone, Poirot repeated. And yet, not alone, Monsieur Cole, for poison of the kind the doctor describes does not administer itself. Someone gave it to her, if not tonight, upon this stage, then earlier, in some other place, at some other hour. He looked around him, at the wings, dim and cluttered with the ordinary debris of a working theatre, at the heavy velvet curtains, still faintly swaying from their unfinished descent, at the small door, half hidden by a folded flat, that he correctly surmised led toward the dressing rooms. But first, he said, half to himself, I think we must establish something rather important. This stage, this door, these wings, were they, in the strictest sense, sealed during the performance, locked, as it were, from any approach but the one we all witnessed? It was a question that would occupy a great deal of the investigation to come, and one to which the answer, when it finally arrived, would prove far stranger than anyone in that theatre, on that terrible evening, could have imagined. The police arrived within the half-hour, in the person of a lean, sharp-eyed detective inspector named Japp, no relation, as he was obliged to explain with some weariness to every new acquaintance, to the other Inspector Japp, whom certain persons in criminal circles remembered, though in this case, as chance would have it, this Japp had heard a great deal about Hercule Poirot from his own more famous namesake, and greeted the little Belgian with a curious mixture of professional caution and personal curiosity. Monsieur Poirot, he said, extending a hand, heard your name mentioned more than once. Didn't expect to find you sitting in the stalls of a murder. I did not expect it either, Inspector, Poirot replied, with the faintest suggestion of a smile beneath his moustaches. I came for Ibsen. I appear to have received, instead, something considerably more interesting, and considerably more sad. Japp's gaze travelled to the still form on the stage, now decently covered, awaiting the police surgeon. Poison, the doctor says. Fast-acting. We'll know more once we've had a proper look. In the meantime, he glanced around at the small, shivering crowd still gathered in the wings, none of whom had been permitted to leave. In the meantime, I understand nobody left this building since the curtain went up. Which means, gentlemen, ladies, his eye moved slowly across the assembled faces. Our murderer, whoever they may be, is very probably still in this room. Nobody spoke. And Hercule Poirot, watching the faces around him with the particular stillness of a man who has begun, quietly, to think, reflected that Detective Inspector Japp was very probably correct, and that the true difficulty of the case lying before them would not be the finding of a murderer among 40 frightened people, but the unravelling of how a woman could be poisoned in full view of an audience, speaking words that were not entirely her own, upon a stage that no one had approached. It was, he thought, going to be a most curious little problem. The empty glass. The Aldwych Playhouse, emptied at last of its shaken audience, each name and address carefully recorded by a young constable with an aching wrist, settled into the particular silence that follows catastrophe, not peace, but exhaustion. It was past midnight. The stage, so recently a place of Norwegian drawing rooms and quiet despair, now bore the more prosaic furniture of a police investigation. A photographer's tripod, a constable's notebook, a police surgeon crouched where Margaret Thorne had fallen. Inspector Japp, having satisfied himself that Poirot's presence was more likely to assist than hinder him, had extended what he clearly considered a great courtesy. "You may look about if you like, Monsieur Poirot. Can't say it'll hurt, and my own fellows tell me you've an eye for this sort of thing." He paused. "Provided you touch nothing." "I touch nothing that is not already asking, most eloquently, to be observed," Poirot replied, and began, with Hastings trailing dutifully behind him, a slow circuit of the stage. It was a large space, deeper than it appeared from the stalls, cluttered at its edges with the accumulated apparatus of a working theatre, flats leaning against one another like exhausted dancers, ropes coiled with the neatness of long habit, a small table set with the props of the second act, untouched since the interval. Poirot's gaze moved over all of it, with the unhurried thoroughness of a man cataloguing a room he intends to remember perfectly. "Here," he said at last, stopping beside a small table set just off stage, in the wings nearest the position where Margaret Thorne had delivered her final speech. Upon it sat a single glass, empty but for a faint residue at its base, beside a small carafe of water. "Her water glass," Hastings said. "For the speech, I suppose. Actresses do get dry-mouthed, don't they, with all that talking?" "Indeed." Poirot bent, without touching the glass, and regarded it closely, his nose wrinkling slightly as he drew a careful breath above its rim. "And yet, Hastings, I observe something curious. The carafe is nearly full. The glass is empty. If Mademoiselle Thorne drank from this glass during her final scene, as its position here, so conveniently placed, would suggest, then she drank the whole of it, and at a single stage, no dry-mouthed actress sips an entire glass in the middle of her most important speech. Maybe she was thirstier than usual. Perhaps." Poirot did not sound convinced. He straightened, and it was here, as he would later admit to Hastings, with the particular good humour a man reserves for his own foolishness, once the danger of it has passed, that he made his error. For he glanced toward the small table, and beyond it, toward a narrow gap between two standing flats, through which a sliver of the wings beyond was visible, and he said, with the confidence of a man who believes he has understood a great deal rather sooner than he actually has, "It is simple, I think, Hastings. The glass was poisoned before the performance began, placed here for her, in this exact position, by someone who knew precisely where she would stand and precisely when she would need to drink. It requires no elaborate mechanism. No one need have approached her during the scene at all. The poison waited for her, patiently, like a spider in its web." He said this with such evident satisfaction that Hastings, unequipped to contradict him, merely nodded and made a note of it in his own small book, as though the matter were now settled. It was not settled. It was, in fact, almost entirely wrong, though the error would not become apparent to Poirot himself until some days later, when a piece of evidence considerably more mundane than a poisoned water glass would force him to reconsider the whole shape of the crime. But that evening, tired, and perhaps still slightly discomposed by having watched a woman die not 20 feet from where he sat, Poirot allowed himself the comfort of a tidy theory, and did not, for the moment, examine it as closely as he examined everything else. It was Detective Inspector Japp, summoned to inspect the glass and carafe himself, who first introduced the small complication that ought to have given Poirot pause. "Surgeon says he doesn't think it was drunk, Monsieur Poirot. Says the residue's wrong for it. If she'd swallowed a lethal dose in that glass, there'd be more than a trace left round the rim. This looks more like it was rinsed, or barely used at all." Poirot's eyebrows rose a fraction. Rinsed, Inspector? That's what he says. We'll know for certain once the lab's had it. But it rather knocks your spider-in-the-web theory on the head, doesn't it? It does, Poirot admitted, with the particular graciousness of a man who has just been shown, gently, that he was mistaken, and who has decided, as he generally did, being fundamentally a reasonable creature beneath the vanity, that there was more dignity in acknowledging an error swiftly than in defending it out of pride. Which means, Inspector, that our murderer is a good deal more careful than I had credited him, or her. This is not the work of an amateur who forgot to clean a glass. This is the work of someone who thought a great deal about what the police would find, and worked very deliberately to leave them as little as possible. Cheerful thought, said Japp dryly. It is, in its way, Poirot said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, a note of genuine, quickening interest, the sound of a man who has just realized that the puzzle before him is a great deal more sophisticated than he first assumed, and who finds, despite the tragedy of its subject, that he cannot help but be delighted by its complexity. For it tells us something of great value, mon ami. It tells us that whoever killed Margaret Thorne did not act upon a sudden impulse of rage or jealousy, seizing whatever weapon lay to hand. No, this was planned, considered, rehearsed, if you will forgive the small joke, as carefully as the play itself. He turned to look once more at the empty stage, at the chalk outline the police photographer had marked upon the boards, and his expression grew, for a moment, quite still. Somewhere in this building, Inspector, there is a person who watched Margaret Thorne die tonight and felt, I think, not horror, but satisfaction. The particular satisfaction of an author watching his own play performed exactly as he intended it. We are not merely hunting a murderer. We are hunting a dramatist. And dramatists, Inspector Japp, in my experience, are rarely content to leave their masterpiece entirely without an audience to appreciate its cleverness. Somewhere, I think, there will be a signature. We have only to find it. 5 people, 5 stories. The following morning, Inspector Japp established a temporary office in what had been the theatre's green room, a low-ceilinged, comfortably shabby chamber lined with photographs of long-forgotten productions and furnished with sagging armchairs that had absorbed, over several decades, the nervous perspiration of several generations of actors awaiting their entrances. It seemed, Poirot reflected, taking his seat in the least sagging of the available chairs, a fitting enough room in which to extract the truth from people whose profession was, after all, the elegant construction of lies. I'll have them in one at a time, Japp said, consulting his notebook. Amory first, I think. He was closest to her when she went down. Charles Amory entered, looking as though he had not slept, which, as it transpired, he had not. He was a narrow, nervous man of perhaps 40, with the sort of face that might have been called handsome in his youth, and had since been worn down, by years of anxious effort, into something merely intense. He sat forward in his chair, hands clasped tightly between his knees, and answered Japp's opening questions in short, clipped sentences that suggested a man rehearsing his own composure. I directed her in 11 productions, he said, in answer to the inevitable question of their relationship. We understood one another. I don't say we were friends, precisely. Margaret didn't really have friends, not in the ordinary sense, but we worked well together. She trusted my eye. That's rare in an actress of her standing. Most of them think they know better than the man who's watching from the stalls. And last night, Poirot asked, speaking for the first time, you directed her also in that performance. Did you notice anything unusual in her manner, before the curtain rose or during the earlier acts? Amory hesitated, and it was a hesitation Poirot noted with interest, not the pause of a man searching his memory, but the pause of a man deciding how much of his memory to share. She seemed distracted, he admitted finally, tense, in a way I hadn't seen from her before a performance. I asked if she was unwell. She said she was fine, that it was nothing, and that I should mind my own business and mind the lighting instead, which was rather more her usual manner, so I didn't press it. "Did you know," Poirot inquired gently, "that during the second act, Mademoiselle Thorne departed, on several occasions, from Ibsen's text?" Amory's head came up sharply. "She what?" The surprise on his face was, Poirot judged, entirely genuine, which was itself a small and useful piece of information, for it told him that whatever message Margaret Thorne had been communicating from the stage the previous evening, she had not been communicating it to her director. "Small departures," Poirot clarified. "A word altered here, a pause extended there, and once, I believe, she looked into the audience in a manner that had nothing to do with her performance." "I noticed nothing of the kind," Amory said slowly, and then, with the particular defensiveness of a professional whose expertise has been quietly called into question, added, "I was watching the lighting cues in the second act. We'd had trouble with them in rehearsal." "I can't say I was watching her every syllable." Poirot inclined his head, satisfied for the moment, and allowed Japp to resume the more conventional business of establishing Amory's movements during the fatal third act. "Amory had been in the wings," he said, "throughout, visible, in fact, to the stage manager and to at least 2 stagehands, a fact Japp noted with evident approval, since it appeared, on its face, to remove Amory from the narrower window of the murder itself, whatever that window might eventually prove to be. Dennis Cole, the stage manager, followed, and gave his account with the flat, methodical precision of a man accustomed to giving reports. "I was at the prompt corner the whole of the third act," he said. "Same as always. I can see the whole stage from there, and most of the wings besides. Nobody went near Miss Thorne during that speech. Nobody could have. She was alone out there from the moment the scene began until she went down." "And before the performance?" Poirot asked. "The water glass and carafe upon the small table in the wings. Who placed them there, Monsieur Cole?" "I did, sir. Same as every performance. Fill the carafe from the tap in the props room. Set it on the table with a clean glass, half an hour before curtain. It's routine. And between the moment you set it there and the moment the curtain rose, who had access to that table?" Cole considered this with evident discomfort. "Anyone backstage, I suppose. The wings aren't locked during that time. Can't be. People are moving props, checking costumes, that sort of thing. I couldn't swear nobody touched it." "You mentioned," Poirot said, changing direction with the smoothness of a man who has learned that suspects answer most honestly when they believe the dangerous question has already passed, "that you could see the whole stage from the prompt corner. Tell me, Monsieur Cole, during the third act, before Mademoiselle Thorne collapsed, did you observe anything unusual? A sound, perhaps, that seemed out of place? A movement in the wings opposite yours?" Cole frowned, and for the first time in the interview seemed genuinely to be searching his memory rather than reciting a prepared account. "There was something," he admitted slowly. "I didn't think much of it at the time. You get all manner of small noises backstage, creaks and settling and what have you. But there was a sort of, I don't know how to put it, a sort of echo, just before she went quiet, as if her voice had come back at her, but wrong, somehow. I put it down to the acoustics. This house has always had odd acoustics in that corner." Poirot's eyes had grown very still. "An echo," he repeated softly. "You are quite certain of this, Monsieur Cole?" "Fairly certain, sir. Can't say I'd swear to it in a court of law. It was very quick." "No," Poirot murmured, half to himself. "I do not think you imagined it, Monsieur Cole. I think, in fact, that you have just given me the most important piece of evidence I have yet received." Japp glanced at him sideways, faintly exasperated by the little Belgian's habit of pronouncing significance upon fragments the inspector himself could make nothing of, but said nothing, and moved the interview along to its close. Vivienne Carr, the understudy, arrived pale and composed in roughly equal measure, dressed in unrelieved black that Poirot suspected, cynically, might have been selected with half an eye to its appropriateness, rather than purely from grief. "I understudied Margaret for 3 years," she said, in answer to Japp's questions, her voice carefully level. "I never went on," Not once. She didn't miss performances. She used to say an actress who misses a performance has no business calling herself an actress. That must have been difficult, Poirot observed. 3 years of preparation, and no opportunity to demonstrate it. Something flickered across Vivienne Carr's face, swiftly suppressed, but not swiftly enough to escape Poirot's notice. It's the business, Monsieur Poirot. One doesn't complain. And yet, he said gently, one may feel it nonetheless, whether or not one complains. Tell me, Mademoiselle Carr, I observed you, during the interval last evening, entering the backstage area through the private door, using your own key. May I ask your purpose? I often go backstage during intervals. It's my job to be ready, in case. She stopped. In case Mademoiselle Thorne could not continue, Poirot finished for her, quite gently, as, in the event, she could not. The silence that followed this observation stretched a fraction longer than was entirely comfortable. I didn't kill her, Vivienne Carr said finally, her composure cracking just slightly at its edges. I know how it looks. I know what everyone will say. The understudy, waiting 3 years, finally gets her chance. But I was in my dressing room from the moment the third act began until Mr. Cole came running to fetch everyone. You can ask Ruth. She'll have heard me through the wall. We share a dividing partition, and it isn't thick. Japp made a note to verify this, and Poirot, watching Vivienne Carr's carefully controlled hands as she folded them in her lap, reflected privately that a woman capable of such disciplined self-possession under questioning was very probably also capable of a great deal else besides. Though discipline, he reminded himself, was not, in itself, evidence of guilt. It was merely evidence of discipline. The interview with Julian Reeve, the theatre's owner, proved shorter and considerably less illuminating, consisting largely of expressions of shock and a somewhat too frequent insistence upon the theatre's previously spotless reputation, a preoccupation Poirot found faintly distasteful, given that a woman lay dead in the theatre's mortuary as a direct consequence of an event Reeve seemed chiefly concerned might damage box office receipts. It was only as the interview drew to its close that Poirot asked, almost as an afterthought, Monsieur Reeve, the man with whom you spoke during the interval last evening, broad of shoulder, and, if I do not mistake myself, rather agitated in his manner. Who was he? Reeve's easy affability faltered, very briefly, before recovering itself. A business matter, Monsieur Poirot. Nothing to do with any of this. Everyone I have interviewed today, Poirot said mildly, has assured me that their particular piece of information had nothing to do with any of this. And yet, Monsieur Reeve, I begin to suspect that a great many small things which appear to have nothing to do with anything will, before this case is concluded, turn out to have everything to do with it. Reeve said nothing further, and Japp, sensing an avenue worth pursuing later, made a careful note of the exchange. By the time the last of that morning's interviews concluded, Poirot sat for some minutes in silence, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, while Hastings watched him with the patient expectation of a man who has learned to recognize the particular quality of stillness that precedes one of his friend's observations. An echo, Hastings, Poirot said at last. A director who did not watch his own leading lady. An understudy who has waited 3 years for an opportunity she insists she did not take. A glass that was rinsed, not drunk from. And an owner who does not wish to discuss his own theatre's business. He shook his head slowly. It is, as I said to Japp last night, a most curious little problem. But I begin to think, mon ami, that we are not looking merely for a person who wished Margaret Thorne dead. We are looking for a person who wished, very specifically, for her to die in exactly this manner, upon that stage, during that speech, in front of that audience. And a wish so particular, Hastings, is rarely born of simple hatred. It is born, I think, of something a good deal more personal. The letter in the wastepaper bin. It was Ruth Hargreaves, Margaret Thorne's dresser, who provided, quite by accident, the first genuine break in the case, though she did so in the most unassuming manner imaginable, and very nearly, did not mention it at all. She had not been formally interviewed the previous day, her name having been recorded by the constable, but somehow overlooked in the general chaos of statements and shock. It was Poirot himself who noticed the omission and asked, with some gentleness, that she be brought to the green room before the day's other business proceeded. She was younger than Poirot had expected, no more than 22, with the anxious, deferential manner of a girl who has spent several years being made to feel, by a demanding employer, that her own opinions were of very little consequence. "I don't know that I can tell you anything useful, sir," she said, twisting her hands in her lap. "I only dressed her. I wasn't there when she— You need not distress yourself, Mademoiselle Hargreaves," Poirot said kindly. "I ask only that you tell me of yesterday as you remember it, from the moment you arrived at the theatre. Even the smallest details. It is often the smallest details that prove, in the end, the most significant." Encouraged, Ruth began a careful account of the afternoon, the usual preparations, the fitting of the second act costume, the arrangement of Margaret Thorne's dressing table, and it was only when she reached the subject of the note that her narrative faltered. "There was a letter," she said slowly, as though only now recalling it. "It came that afternoon. I don't know who delivered it. It was simply on the dressing table when I brought in the fresh flowers. Miss Thorne read it, and I thought nothing of it, only she was very quiet afterward, quieter than I'd ever known her before a performance, and she threw it away." Poirot went very still. "Threw it away, Mademoiselle Hargreaves? Where?" "In the wastepaper bin beside her mirror, sir. I didn't think to keep it. Why would I? Actresses get all manner of letters, admirers mostly, or people wanting favours." "And this bin," Poirot said, rising from his chair with a speed that rather startled Hastings, who had grown accustomed, over many years, to his friend's more theatrical pauses for effect. "Has it since been emptied?" Ruth's face fell. "I don't know, sir. The dressing-room's been locked since it happened." Constables had the key. Within a quarter of an hour, Poirot stood in Margaret Thorne's dressing-room, a space that had been, until the previous evening, a place of ordinary vanity and ordinary preparation, and now bore the particular stillness of a room whose occupant will never return to it. The mirror still held, tucked into its frame, a scattering of photographs and telegrams of goodwill. The powder and paint sat undisturbed upon the table, and beside the mirror, exactly as Ruth had described, stood a small brass wastepaper bin, its contents undisturbed by anyone in the 2 days since Margaret Thorne had last used the room. Poirot knelt, and with the careful precision of a man handling something considerably more valuable than its appearance suggested, extracted a small crumpled ball of paper from beneath a discarded silk stocking. He smoothed it flat upon the dressing table, and Hastings, peering over his shoulder, read the 3 brief lines it contained. "You know what you did. You know what it cost. Tonight you will finally pay for it, in front of everyone, as it should have been from the start." There was no signature. "Well," said Hastings after a long moment, "that's rather damning, isn't it? Sounds like a direct threat." "It is a threat," Poirot agreed slowly, turning the paper over in his fingers, examining the ordinary stationery, the ordinary ink, the handwriting, neat, controlled, giving away, to Poirot's practiced eye, almost nothing of its author's identity beyond a certain evident education and a hand that had not trembled in the writing of it. But observe, Hastings, what it does not say. It does not name the deed for which Mademoiselle Thorne is to pay. It does not name its author, and it speaks of payment in front of everyone, as it should have been from the start, language which suggests not merely revenge, but correction. A wrong that was hidden, now to be made public. This is not the letter of a man driven mad by simple jealousy, Hastings. This is the letter of someone who believes, quite sincerely, that justice has been owed for a very long time, and is now, at last, about to be delivered. He folded the letter carefully into his notebook and rose. It also confirms, he added, half to himself, what I began to suspect from Monsieur Cole's account of the echo, and from Mademoiselle Thorne's own strange departures from her script during the second act. She knew. She had received a warning, and rather than take it to the police, or to her director, or to anyone at all who might have protected her, she chose, with a confidence that strikes me, Hastings, as very typical of a woman accustomed to controlling every situation in which she finds herself, to handle the matter herself. She was not merely performing Hedda Gabler last night. She was, I think, attempting a performance of her own, sending some manner of signal, during the second act, to the very person who had threatened her, believing herself entirely capable of managing whatever confrontation was to follow. And instead, Hastings said quietly, she was murdered in the middle of it. Instead, Poirot agreed, she was murdered in the middle of it, which tells us, mon ami, that whoever wrote this letter was not merely threatening her from a distance. They were close enough, near enough to the stage, near enough to her preparations, to act upon that threat within hours of delivering it. This narrows our net considerably, though it does not, alas, tell us yet whom it should close around. It was Detective Inspector Japp, returning to the green room some hours later with the look of a man who has spent his morning productively and wishes it acknowledged, who introduced what appeared, for a brief and misleading period, to be the case's decisive breakthrough. "Found something you'll want to hear, Monsieur Poirot," he said, settling into his chair with evident satisfaction. "Had my sergeant going through Reeves' business papers, that conversation you flagged, the broad-shouldered fellow in the interval. Turns out our Mr. Reeve owes a rather considerable sum to a moneylender by the name of Victor Slade. The very same Victor Slade, as it happens, who was standing in the foyer last night, and who has, according to my sergeant's inquiries, made rather pointed remarks in the past about theatres being unlucky investments when their owners fall behind on payment." "A moneylender," Hastings said, sitting forward with interest. "That's a motive, surely. If Reeve was in debt to this Slade fellow, and Margaret Thorne was somehow connected to the money—" "There is no evidence whatsoever," Poirot interrupted mildly, "that Mademoiselle Thorne was connected to Monsieur Reeve's debts at all, Hastings. You are constructing a motive from a coincidence of geography. Two men speaking quietly in a foyer during an interval is not, in itself, a conspiracy to poison an actress. But it's worth pursuing," Japp said, faintly defensive of his morning's work. "Everything is worth pursuing, Inspector, until it is proven not worth pursuing," Poirot said, with the diplomatic tact of a man who has learned, over many years, the delicate art of managing a policeman's pride. "By all means, speak with Monsieur Slade. It may prove significant. But I confess I do not think it will prove to be the heart of our matter. For one reason above all others, Monsieur Slade, whatever his business with Reeve, does not strike me as a man inclined to write letters accusing an actress of an old and hidden wrong requiring, in his words, payment in front of everyone. That is not the language of a debt collector, Inspector. That is the language of someone with a very old, very personal grievance, and I do not think we will find it in Monsieur Reeve's account books." Japp, though visibly unconvinced, agreed to pursue the Slade connection regardless, a decision that would, in the days to come, consume a not inconsiderable portion of police time before yielding, precisely as Poirot had predicted, nothing whatsoever of relevance to Margaret Thorne's death. Poirot himself, meanwhile, returned his attention to the letter and to the single word within it that had begun, quietly, to trouble him more than any other. Finally, "Not tonight, you will pay for what you have done, but tonight you will finally pay for it." A word that spoke not of a recent injury, freshly discovered, but of an old one, long carried, long waited upon. Somewhere, in Margaret Thorne's past, Poirot was now certain, lay the true beginning of this case. An old wrong, done to someone, at some point long before that final, fatal performance. And it was there, and not in the theatre's present-day business dealings, that the answer would ultimately be found. He said as much to Hastings that evening, over a quiet dinner neither of them much enjoyed. "We must learn," he said, "not who Margaret Thorne was in the last year of her life, Hastings, but who she was 10 years ago, 15 perhaps, Somewhere in her past, there is a person who has waited a very long time for last night to happen, and has, at last, grown tired of waiting. The trick of the voice. The following afternoon brought news from the police laboratory that obliged Poirot to reconsider, rather more thoroughly than he found comfortable, the theory he had advanced with such confidence on the night of the murder itself. "Definitely not the water glass," Japp reported, laying the analyst's findings upon the green room table. "No trace of poison in the residue at all. The surgeon was right. It had been rinsed clean, near enough. Whatever killed her, Monsieur Poirot, it wasn't delivered in that glass." Poirot received this news with the particular grace of a man accustomed to being wrong occasionally, and rather more interested in the fact than embarrassed by it. "Then I was mistaken, Inspector, and I am obliged to you for correcting me so promptly. It is always better to know one is wrong on a Tuesday than to remain wrong until Friday." He tapped the report thoughtfully. "But if not the glass, then how? The surgeon is certain of poisoning. Cyanide, was it not, or something closely resembling it?" "Potassium cyanide," Japp confirmed. "Fast, as these things go. A minute, perhaps two, from ingestion to collapse, depending on the dose. Surgeon says there's a faint burn to the tissue of the mouth and throat, consistent with it having been swallowed directly. Not injected, not absorbed through the skin. She ate or drank it, Monsieur Poirot, and not from that glass." Poirot sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, in the attitude Hastings had long ago learned not to interrupt. "A minute, perhaps two," he repeated softly. "Inspector, tell me, at what point precisely, in her final speech, did Mademoiselle Thorne begin to falter?" Monsieur Cole spoke of an echo, just before she fell silent. "If the poison required a minute or more to act, then it was administered before that speech began, and yet she spoke clearly, without difficulty, for its first several lines." "Which means she took it just before walking on stage," Japp said. "In the wings, perhaps, in the moments before her entrance." "Perhaps," Poirot said, though his tone carried the particular hesitation of a man who suspects the obvious answer is not, in this instance, the correct one. And yet Monsieur Cole was positioned, by his own account, precisely where he could observe the wings on both sides during that period. He saw nothing. No one approached her. If she swallowed poison in the moments before her entrance, either Monsieur Cole is lying to us most convincingly, or Mademoiselle Thorne administered it to herself, which raises a question I confess I have not yet permitted myself to consider seriously. Was this, after all, not murder, but something else entirely? Hastings looked startled. "Suicide? But Poirot, the letter." "The letter troubles me also, in this new light," Poirot admitted. "A woman does not generally write herself a threatening note and then hide it in her own wastepaper bin, Hastings, unless she wishes it to be found. And if she wished it found, why conceal it at all? No, I do not think it was suicide. But I begin to think, mon ami, that I have been asking the wrong question entirely. I have been asking when the poison was administered. Perhaps I ought instead to have been asking how a poison requiring a minute or more to act could produce a collapse that appeared, to every witness, to occur at almost the precise moment predicted by an anonymous letter, as though the murderer possessed not merely the means to kill Margaret Thorne, but the power to select, with theatrical precision, the very instant of her death." He fell silent again, and this time the silence stretched long enough that Japp began, visibly, to grow impatient. "Well, have you an answer, or haven't you?" "I have," Poirot said slowly. "The beginning of one. Inspector, I should like, if you would permit it, to return to the stage itself. And this time, I should like to examine not the wings, nor the water glass, but the stage machinery. The ropes, the flies, the trapdoors, if such a house as this possesses them, and I should like, above all, to speak again with Monsieur Cole regarding this echo he describes, for I begin to suspect, Inspector, that it was not an echo at all, but something a great deal more deliberate." The Aldwych Playhouse, examined in the flat, unglamorous light of a Wednesday afternoon, with no performance to soften its edges, revealed itself to be a building of considerably greater complexity than its modest exterior suggested. Beneath the stage lay a warren of understage machinery, trapdoors, counterweight systems, a small mechanical lift once used, Dennis Cole explained, for a long-forgotten production requiring an actor to rise dramatically from beneath the boards. But it was not the trapdoors that drew Poirot's attention. It was, instead, a small chamber built into the theatre's rear wall, directly behind the point on stage where Margaret Thorne had stood during her final speech. A chamber that Cole identified, with some surprise at being asked about it at all, as the theatre's old prompt box. "Not used much these days," he explained, leading Poirot and Hastings up a narrow iron stair. "Used to have a prompter sitting in there in the old days, feeding lines to actors through a grill in the set. Went out of fashion years back. Actors don't like to be reminded they might forget their lines, or so I'm told. We keep the old speaking tube system in place, though. Curiosity, more than anything." "A speaking tube," Poirot repeated, and Hastings, watching his friend's face, saw the particular stillness that meant something of significance had just fallen into place. "Show me, if you please, Monsieur Cole, precisely where this tube emerges upon the stage." It emerged, as it transpired, in a small ornamental grille set into the base of a fixed set piece near the very spot where Margaret Thorne had stood. A grille so unobtrusive, so thoroughly disguised as decoration, that not one of the several dozen persons who had examined that stage in the days since the murder had thought to give it a second glance. "An echo," Poirot said softly, kneeling before the grille and examining it with great care. "Monsieur Cole, you told us you heard, just before Mademoiselle Thorne fell silent, a sound like her own voice returning to her, wrongly. I put it to you now, is it not possible that what you heard was not an echo at all, but a second voice, speaking through this tube, so closely timed to her own words, and so similar in cadence, that from the prompt corner it appeared to be nothing more than a trick of the house's acoustics?" Cole stared at the grille, and then at Poirot, with the expression of a man watching a familiar room rearrange itself before his eyes. "You mean someone was down there, in the old prompt box, speaking to her, through the tube, while she was on stage?" "I mean precisely that," Poirot said, rising. "And I mean also, I think, that this speaking tube provides us with the answer to a question that has troubled me since the surgeon's report arrived this morning. A poison requiring a minute or more to act need not be swallowed in a single dose upon a single glass, Monsieur Cole. It may be administered gradually, in small measure, disguised within something Mademoiselle Thorne would have had every reason to place in her own mouth without suspicion, timed with exquisite care by someone who knew, to the second, when her final line would fall, and who wished to be certain that her collapse occurred not before the audience's attention, nor after it, but at the precise moment of maximum and terrible effect. Hastings, following the implication through to its natural conclusion, went rather pale. "You mean the murderer was down there, in this box, speaking to her, perhaps even comforting her, while she died?" "I mean," Poirot said quietly, "that our murderer possesses not merely a motive rooted in some old and grievous wrong, and not merely the technical knowledge required to administer a slow poison with theatrical precision, but also, and this, I confess, is the detail that disturbs me most profoundly, a taste for the dramatic that borders upon the theatrical genius. He did not merely wish Margaret Thorne dead, Hastings. He wished to speak to her as she died. He wished her to know, in her final moments, precisely who had done this to her, and precisely why. This was not an execution carried out at a cowardly distance. This was a confrontation, the confrontation, I think, that Mademoiselle Thorne herself believed she was arranging when she altered her lines during the second act, save that our murderer had understood her intentions rather better than she understood his, and had prepared, with considerably greater care, for what was to follow." He looked down once more at the small, unobtrusive grille, silent now, and added, in a voice that had grown very grave, We are not hunting a murderer who struck in a moment of panic, Inspector Japp. We are hunting a person who has waited, by their own written word, a very long time for finally, and who constructed, with the patience of a playwright polishing a manuscript through many long years of revision, the precise and terrible circumstances of Margaret Thorne's death. Such patience, messieurs, does not belong to a stranger. It belongs to someone who has known her, and hated her, or loved her, or both at once, for a very great many years indeed. The woman Margaret Thorne had been. If the speaking tube had answered the question of how, it had done nothing whatsoever to answer the question of who, and it was this second question that occupied Poirot for the better part of the following 2 days, spent not within the walls of the Aldwych Playhouse, but in the considerably less theatrical surroundings of newspaper archives, theatrical agents' offices, and one memorably dusty solicitor's chamber in Lincoln's Inn. "You wish to know," he said to Hastings on the second evening, laying a small stack of papers upon the table between them with the satisfaction of a man who has, at last, assembled the pieces he required, who Margaret Thorne was, before she became Margaret Thorne. "It has taken some little effort, but I believe I now know." "Well?" Hastings leaned forward. "Her name, mon ami, was not always Margaret Thorne. She was born Margaret Fenwick, in a town in the north of England, of no particular distinction, and she began her career upon the stage, not in London, but in a small provincial repertory company, the Marchmont Players, based in Leeds, some 18 years ago. It was there, Hastings, that she first performed under the direction of a man named Edmund Voss." He paused, allowing the name to settle. "Voss," he continued, "was, by every account I have gathered, a director of very considerable promise, spoken of, in the theatrical circles of the time, as a young man destined for great things. He and Margaret Fenwick, as she then was, were reportedly very close. Some said engaged to be married, though I have found no formal record of it. And then, 18 years ago, something occurred that ended both the engagement, if engagement it was, and Edmund Voss's career entirely." "What happened?" "A production of the Marchmont Players, a new play, written as it happens by Voss himself, his first and, as it transpired, his only significant work, was accused, upon its opening night, of plagiarism. A rival playwright came forward, claiming that substantial portions of Voss's script had been lifted, almost verbatim, from an unpublished manuscript of his own, to which Voss had apparently had access some months prior. The scandal was considerable for its time. Voss was disgraced. His career ended before it had properly begun, and the Marchmont Players themselves were obliged to close their doors within the year, the theatre's reputation too damaged to survive. And Margaret? Margaret Fenwick, Poirot said slowly, left Leeds within a month of the scandal, changed her name, and began, in London, the career that would eventually make her Margaret Thorne. I have spoken, Hastings, with an elderly theatrical agent who remembered the affair, a man who represented several of the Marchmont Players at the time, and who told me something I found most illuminating. He said it was widely believed, though never proven, that it was Margaret herself who had provided the accusing playwright with the evidence against Voss, that she had, in effect, betrayed the man she was to marry, whether from jealousy or ambition or some falling out never publicly explained, and that her own swift departure to London and her subsequent rapid success struck a number of her former colleagues as considerably more than coincidental. Hastings sat back, his expression grave. So, Voss believes she ruined him, deliberately, and has spent 18 years waiting to— It is a possibility that fits our facts most elegantly, Poirot agreed. A man who lost everything, his career, his reputation, his prospects, through what he believed to be the calculated treachery of the woman he loved, would carry, I think, precisely the sort of grievance our letter describes. An old wrong, a payment long overdue. And a director, for Voss was, whatever else befell him, trained in the theatre, familiar with its machinery, its speaking tubes, its timing, would possess precisely the knowledge required to stage her death with such theatrical precision. "Then he's our man," Hastings said, with the particular relief of someone who prefers his solutions arrived at swiftly. "Have you found him? Where is he now?" "That," Poirot admitted, with a small and characteristic frown, "is where my satisfaction in this theory becomes considerably more modest. I have traced Edmund Voss's movements for some years after the Leeds scandal, a period of decline, drink, minor and unglamorous employment, the usual sad trajectory of a disgraced man with nowhere left to fall. But the trail, Hastings, grows cold some 9 years ago. I can find no record of Edmund Voss after that date. No employment, no residence, no death certificate, nothing whatsoever. He appears to have vanished entirely. Perhaps he changed his name too." "Perhaps," Poirot said. "It is, in fact, the possibility that troubles me most. For if Edmund Voss changed his name, as Margaret Fenwick changed hers, then our murderer may be a man we have already interviewed, a man sitting, at this very moment, somewhere within the small circle of persons connected to the Aldwych Playhouse, wearing an identity we have accepted without question, waiting, as the letter said, for finally to arrive." He rose and moved to the window, looking out over the darkened street with the particular stillness of a man assembling, piece by piece, a picture he did not yet wish to speak aloud. "Consider, Hastings, who among our suspects possesses theatrical training, technical knowledge of a stage's machinery, and a connection, however concealed, to Margaret Thorne's distant past? Consider also who among them might have aged, in 18 years, sufficiently to escape easy recognition by a woman who had every reason not to look for him, having spent nearly 2 decades believing, or hoping, that Edmund Voss no longer existed to trouble her at all." "Amory," Hastings said slowly. "Charles Amory. He's the right age, isn't he? And he's a director. He'd know the stage machinery. And he said himself he'd worked with her on 11 productions, that they understood one another." "It is a most attractive theory," Poirot agreed. "And yet, Hastings, I find myself resisting it, for one reason that troubles me a great deal. When I asked Monsieur Amory whether he had noticed Mademoiselle Thorne's small departures from her text during the second act, his surprise struck me as entirely genuine. A man who had spent 18 years constructing so elaborate a revenge, who had planted a threatening letter and prepared a speaking tube and calculated the precise timing of a slow poison, would not, I think, have failed to notice the one woman in the building attempting, through coded alterations to her lines, to communicate with him directly. If Amory is Voss, then Voss did not understand that Margaret Thorne was speaking to him at all during that second act. And that strikes me as a very curious oversight in a man of such otherwise meticulous planning. Then who?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached again for his small stack of papers and drew out one final document, a photograph, faded and creased, that the elderly theatrical agent had, with some reluctance, permitted him to borrow. "This," he said, laying it upon the table, "is a photograph of the Marchmont Players, taken some 18 years ago, in the final season before the company's collapse. Margaret Fenwick stands here, in the center, considerably younger than the woman we knew, but unmistakably herself. And here, beside her," he indicated a tall, dark-haired young man at the photograph's edge, "is Edmund Voss." Hastings studied the photograph closely, and then looked up at Poirot with an expression of considerable confusion. "But Poirot, I don't recognize him at all. He doesn't look like anyone we've interviewed." "No," Poirot agreed quietly. "He does not look like Charles Amory, nor Dennis Cole, nor Julian Reeve, nor any other man among our current suspects. Which means, Hastings, either that Edmund Voss is not, after all, our murderer, a possibility I have not yet dismissed, or that I have been looking, all this while, at entirely the wrong face in this photograph." He tapped the image once more, his finger resting now not upon the tall, dark-haired young man at its edge, but upon a second figure, smaller and less distinct, standing quietly at the photograph's margin. A young woman, watching Margaret Fenwick and Edmund Voss, with an expression the camera had, quite by accident, preserved for 18 years, and which Poirot now studied with the particular intensity of a man who has just realized his entire investigation has been constructed upon a single, unexamined assumption. "Tell me, Hastings," he said slowly, "when a woman writes an anonymous letter promising that her victim will finally pay for an old and grievous wrong, why do we assume, so very readily, that its author must be a man?" The final curtain. Poirot arranged the confrontation, as he arranged most things of importance, upon a stage, for it seemed to him, he explained to Japp, entirely fitting that a murder conceived with such theatrical precision should be unmasked in the very place it had been performed. By 7 o'clock that evening, the small company gathered once more in the stalls of the Aldwych Playhouse. Charles Amory, pale and uneasy. Dennis Cole, arms folded, watching everything with the wary attention of a man who distrusted surprises in his own theatre. Julian Reeve, fidgeting with his cufflinks. Ruth Hargreaves, seated quietly at the row's end, and Vivian Carr, composed as ever, in the same unrelieved black she had worn to every interview since Margaret Thorne's death. Poirot stood upon the stage itself, in almost the precise spot where Margaret Thorne had fallen, with the small brass grill of the old speaking tube visible at his feet. "I have asked you all here," he began, "because I believe I now understand not only how Margaret Thorne died, but why. And I think it only just that those of you who knew her, however imperfectly, should hear the truth spoken aloud, rather than read of it, in due course, in the pages of a newspaper." He held up the faded photograph. 18 years ago, in Leeds, a young director named Edmund Voss was destroyed by an accusation of plagiarism. An accusation, I have come to believe, engineered by a young actress named Margaret Fenwick, who would later become known to all of you as Margaret Thorne. Whether from jealousy or from a ruthless calculation of her own advancement, she provided the evidence that ended his career, and did so, I think, without ever once looking back to consider what became of him afterward. "What did become of him?" Amory asked quietly. "Edmund Voss never fully recovered from his disgrace," Poirot said. "He drifted, for some years, through minor employment and considerable drink, and died, I have since confirmed through records I ought to have consulted rather sooner, some 11 years ago, in poverty, and largely forgotten." He paused. "But he did not die alone in the world. He left behind a daughter, a girl of perhaps 12 at the time of his disgrace, who grew up watching her father's slow collapse, and who grew up believing, with the absolute, uncomplicated certainty of a child who loves her parent, that the woman responsible for it should one day answer for what she had done. Every eye in the stalls had turned, by now, toward Vivian Carr, though she herself sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her expression giving away nothing whatsoever. That daughter, Poirot continued, trained for the stage, perhaps from genuine love of it, perhaps, in part, because it offered her a path toward the woman she had never forgotten. She changed her name, as her father's disgrace made her own too dangerous to carry, and some years ago she secured a position as understudy to the very actress whose testimony had ruined her father's life, a position that required, I imagine, considerable patience, and a discipline of self-control that few among us could sustain for so long. 3 years, Mademoiselle Carr told me herself, waiting for a chance to perform that never came, because Margaret Thorne did not miss performances. "This is absurd," Vivian said, her voice steady, though Poirot noted the faint whiteness now at her knuckles. "You've built an elaborate story from an old photograph and a coincidence of timing." "Not entirely a coincidence," Poirot said gently. "You wrote the letter, Mademoiselle Carr, or should I say Mademoiselle Voss, 3 days before the performance, warning her that she would finally pay, language that speaks not of a sudden grievance, but of one carried for many years. You administered the poison not in a single dose, but gradually, Over several days, through the throat pastilles Mademoiselle Thorne kept in her dressing room and relied upon before every significant performance. Pastilles to which you, as understudy, had regular and unremarked access. A slow accumulation timed with the precision of someone who understood exactly how much would be required and exactly when its final effect would manifest, during her last great speech before the audience she had spent her career courting. "And the tube," Japp put in. "Ah, yes. The tube." Poirot's gaze did not leave Vivian Carr's face. "You told us you were in your dressing room throughout the third act, mademoiselle, and that Mademoiselle Hargreaves would confirm hearing you through the dividing wall. I believe her. I do not think she lied to us. I think, rather, that what she heard was a phonograph recording of your own voice, rehearsing lines, left playing in your dressing room while you yourself slipped down to the old prompt box beneath the stage, a device not unlike those used by directors to record notes for their actors, easily purchased, easily concealed, and easily returned to its case once its purpose was served. From that box, through the speaking tube, behind the very set piece where Mademoiselle Thorne stood, you spoke to her in her final moments, softly enough that Monsieur Cole, at the prompt corner, mistook it for a trick of the house's acoustics. What did you say to her? Ruth asked suddenly, her young face stricken. In those last moments, what did you say? For a long moment, nobody spoke. Then Vivian Carr's composure, so carefully maintained through every interview, through every question, through 2 days of grief that had never, in fact, been grief at all, finally broke. "I told her his name," she said, very quietly. "I told her I was his daughter. I told her that she had 30 seconds left to live, and that I wanted the very last thing she ever heard to be the name of the man she destroyed." Her voice caught, and something that had been held rigidly in place for 18 years seemed, at last, to collapse. She didn't even remember him properly. "Do you understand that?" I asked her, and in her last breath she looked confused, as though she genuinely could not recall which of the men she had ruined I meant. My father gave her everything, his work, his trust, his whole future, and she couldn't even remember his name. The stalls had gone entirely silent. "He used to talk about her," Vivian continued, staring now at nothing, at some point far beyond the little theatre's walls. Even at the end, when he could barely speak from the drink, he'd talk about Margaret Fenwick, about how brilliant she'd been, how much he'd loved her, as though she hadn't destroyed him at all, as though it had simply been bad luck. "I spent 18 years understanding what he never could, that she did it deliberately, that she chose her own success over him, without a second thought, and never once looked back to see what she'd left behind." "And so you became an actress," Poirot said quietly, "and you waited, with a patience I confess I find almost as remarkable as it is terrible, for the opportunity to ensure that her final performance, upon the stage she loved above all things, would be the one performance in her life over which she had absolutely no control." Vivian Carr said nothing further. She did not need to. Detective Inspector Japp rose, and the formal words of arrest, spoken quietly into the hush of the empty theatre, seemed to Poirot, watching the small, composed figure who had waited 18 years for this single evening, less like the conclusion of a police matter than the final line of a very old and very sad play, delivered, at last, to its intended audience. Later that night, in the quiet of Hastings's rooms, the two friends sat over a final glass of brandy, and Hastings, still turning the case over in his mind, asked the question that had been troubling him since the stage had emptied. "Do you think she was sorry, Poirot?" At the end, Poirot considered this for some time before answering. "I think, Hastings, that Mademoiselle Voss believed herself entirely justified, and I do not think that belief has left her even now, in a police cell, contemplating what awaits her. That is the particular tragedy of a grief carried too long without release. It curdles, eventually, into something that no longer resembles grief at all, but feels, to the person carrying it, exactly like justice." He turned his glass slowly in his hand. Margaret Thorne did a cruel thing 18 years ago to a man who loved her, and she never answered for it in any court, nor to any authority, nor even, I think, within the privacy of her own conscience. But the answer she received instead was not justice, Hastings. It was merely another cruelty, dressed very carefully in justice's clothing, and rehearsed, I am sorry to say, with rather more skill than justice usually manages. He set down his glass and looked, for a moment, older and more tired than Hastings had seen him in some time. That, mon ami, is the trouble with revenge, staged as carefully as any play. The audience applauds the cleverness of it, and never quite notices that when the curtain falls, there are two tragedies lying upon the stage instead of one.